This billionaire's son had never taken a single step in his life until the new maid did something so impossible, so unbelievable, that it forced him to try. But here's the thing, she wasn't who she said she was. And what she was hiding changed everything. He's never walked, not even once. It was the sentence that seemed to follow Ethan Cole everywhere he went. Whether whispered by relatives at family gatherings or murmured by strangers who thought he couldn't hear them, those 5 words were like a shadow he could never escape. Ethan was 12 years old, a quiet, pale-faced boy with messy brown hair and hazel eyes that always seemed to be searching for something far away. But unlike other boys his age, Ethan had never run across a field, never kicked a ball, never raced anyone to the end of the street. He had been born with a rare condition that left his legs so weak they could barely hold his weight. Doctors had told his parents that it was possible he could walk one day with the right therapy, the right training, and the right determination. They used words like hope and potential. But Ethan never believed them. Years of failed attempts had taught him one thing: falling hurt. And not just physically. The worst part was the crushing disappointment in people's eyes when he couldn't do what they were hoping for. So he stopped trying. Most of his life was spent in a sleek black wheelchair, rolling from one corner of his enormous home to another. And what a home it was! A sprawling white stone mansion perched on a hill, with massive windows that overlooked perfectly trimmed gardens and a private lake glistening in the distance. Chandeliers dripped from the ceilings, golden railings lined the grand staircase, and marble floors shone so brightly you could see your reflection in them. His father, Richard Cole, was one of the richest men in the country. Owner of a chain of luxury hotels, Richard's face often appeared in business magazines. He was the kind of man who made deals over the phone while walking briskly through airports, always dressed in tailored suits and shiny shoes. He loved his son. Of that, there was no doubt, but he loved his work too, and it always seemed to demand more of his time. In his own way, Richard tried to help. He spared no expense on his son's condition. The best therapists, world-class doctors, custom-designed exercise machines, they all came through the mansion doors at one point or another. But no matter how many experts they hired, Ethan's answer was the same. No, I'm not standing. I'm not trying. The boy had made peace with his world inside the chair. His days followed the same quiet rhythm: breakfast in the sunlit dining room, hours reading adventure books in the library, watching old movies in the home theater, and sometimes rolling himself out onto the balcony to feel the wind on his face. He had friends at school, but since most activities involved running, sports, or playground games, he often found himself sitting alone, observing instead of joining. He wasn't sad exactly, just distant, as though life was something happening to other people. What made it worse was how others treated him. Adults bent down to speak to him in slow, exaggerated voices, as if he couldn't understand normal speech. Kids either pitied him or treated him like he was made of glass, careful not to bump into him, afraid to joke too loudly around him. No one spoke to him like he was just a boy. Then, everything began to change. It was a quiet Monday morning in late spring. The air smelled faintly of blooming flowers drifting in from the garden. Ethan was in his usual spot by the living room window, sketching in his notebook, when he heard the sound of wheels rolling over the marble floor. But it wasn't his wheelchair. A tall, slender woman pushed a cleaning cart into the hallway. She was young, maybe mid-20s, with skin the color of rich cocoa, her hair tied neatly back in a bun. She wore the crisp black and white uniform of the household staff, but there was something in her posture, a quiet confidence, that made her seem different. Ethan watched her for a while, half hidden behind the curtain. She moved with a steady, unhurried grace, dusting the hallway table before glancing up and catching his gaze. She smiled, not the polite, cautious smile he was used to, but a warm, genuine one. Then she did something no one else in the house ever did. She walked right over to him. "Hey," she said cheerfully, leaning slightly so they were at eye level. "I'm Grace. You like puzzles? I'm terrible at them, but I'll play if you want." Ethan blinked at her, caught off guard. She didn't ask about his legs. She didn't stare at the wheelchair. She didn't act as though she were speaking to someone fragile. She just talked to him. From that moment on, he noticed her everywhere, polishing silver in the dining room, carrying laundry up the grand staircase, watering the flowers in the sunroom. and she never looked tired or rushed. There was something in the way she moved, something strong, as though she carried more than just her own weight in life. It was subtle at first, but Ethan began to feel something unusual whenever she was around. Not pity, not sadness, but curiosity. That curiosity grew into fascination the morning he saw her do something that made him forget to breathe, but that moment hadn't happened yet. For now, all Ethan knew was that the quiet, unchanging routine of his life had been interrupted. Grace wasn't like anyone else in the mansion, and for reasons he couldn't yet explain, she made him wonder about things he had long given up on. He didn't know it yet, but this was the first ripple in a wave that would change his life forever. Her name was Grace. It was a simple name, but it suited her perfectly. She was young, no older than 25, with warm brown eyes that seemed to notice everything without staring, and a calm, quiet confidence that filled the room the moment she stepped in. Ethan first saw her on a sunny Tuesday morning. The mansion's polished marble hallway reflected the light streaming in through tall windows as a soft clink of glass echoed from somewhere in the kitchen. Then, the steady sound of rolling wheels approached, but it wasn't his wheelchair this time. Grace appeared, pushing a cleaning cart neatly stocked with sprays, folded cloths, and a silver bucket. Her uniform was crisp, but her movements were anything but stiff. She glided across the floor as if she had walked these halls for years, even though Ethan knew she was brand new. And then she did something that caught him completely off guard. She looked right at him, not at his wheelchair, not at his legs, but at him. And she smiled. Not the polite, half-forced smile people often gave him, the kind that tried to hide pity behind politeness. No, Grace's smile was genuine, open, warm, and unafraid. She walked over without hesitation. "Hey, I'm Grace," she said cheerfully, leaning down so they were at eye level. "You like puzzles? I'm terrible at them, but I'll play if you want." Ethan just blinked at her for a moment. He wasn't used to this. Most of the staff spoke to him carefully, like he might break if they said the wrong thing. But Grace didn't lower her voice to that slow, overly gentle tone. She didn't act like she had to be extra careful around him. She just treated him like a normal person. From that moment, Ethan couldn't help but notice her. She laughed easily, and when she laughed, it wasn't quiet or restrained like most employees in the house. It was a real laugh, the kind you could hear from down the hallway. She moved around the mansion with an ease that didn't seem like work. Her steps were steady, her posture straight, and her eyes always seemed to know where everything was, even in rooms she just entered for the first time. And there was something else. Grace seemed to know exactly when Ethan was lonely, even if he said nothing. Sometimes, she'd stop her dusting to ask if he wanted to join her in the garden. Other times, she'd leave a book from the library on the table next to his chair without a word, as if she knew it was the perfect one for him. But beneath all of his kindness, there was something strange. Something Ethan couldn't quite put into words. It was a week later when he first saw a glimpse of it. The morning sun was warm, and the air smelled faintly of roses from the garden. Ethan was on the second-floor balcony, sketching in his notebook, when he saw Grace coming up the long front path from the laundry house. She carried not one, but two huge wicker laundry baskets, one stacked on top of the other. At first, Ethan thought she was struggling. Anyone else would have been. But Grace, she was carrying them with just one arm. Her other hand hung loosely at her side, as if this enormous load weighed nothing at all. And she wasn't rushing. She wasn't wobbling. Her steps were slow, deliberate, and perfectly balanced as she climbed the mansion's wide stone stairs. Ethan stared. His own father's bodyguards, big men with years of gym training, sometimes carried laundry or furniture up those stairs, and even they looked tired halfway up. But Grace didn't even breathe hard. By the time she disappeared inside, Ethan's mind was buzzing. Who is this woman? The question clung to him for the rest of the day. He noticed how her grip on heavy objects never faltered, how she could lift a crystal vase one-handed while rearranging furniture with the other. She wasn't muscular in the way athletes usually were. There was no bulging strength on display, but she had a quiet, controlled power, the kind that came from years of training, not months. But it wasn't just her physical strength that felt mysterious. It was her eyes, the way they sometimes grew distant, as if she was remembering something far away. Ethan didn't know it yet, But Grace's past was nothing like the life she lived now. And soon, that past, and her unbelievable abilities, would become the very thing that pulled him out of the life he thought he was stuck in forever. For now, he just knew one thing: Grace was not like anyone else in his world. And he was going to find out why. It happened on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, the kind of day when the whole world feels heavier. Dark clouds smothered the sun, turning the sky into a sheet of gray. Outside, the wind howled through the tall trees surrounding the Cole mansion. Fat drops of rain splattered against the windows, and every so often, thunder growled somewhere in the distance, deep and menacing. Inside, the grand living room felt like a safe little island. The fireplace crackled, sending waves of warmth across the polished floor. Ethan sat curled up in his wheelchair near the fire, a book open in his lap. He wasn't really reading. His eyes kept drifting to the rain racing down the glass. Grace was nearby, working her way across the room with a mop and steady, practiced strokes. The soft swish-swish of the mop was almost hypnotic. It was an ordinary afternoon. Or at least it started that way. Then Grace's phone rang. The sharp chime cut through the calm. She glanced at the screen, and instantly, something about her face changed. The warmth in her eyes faded, replaced by sharp focus. She answered quickly. "Yeah." "What? Are you sure?" Her voice was different now, low, urgent, and fast. Ethan had never heard her sound like that before. Before he could even ask what was going on, she ended the call and slid the phone into her pocket. Without a word, she set the mop against the wall and started moving. But this wasn't the casual, graceful way she usually walked. This was fast, determined. Ethan turned in his chair to watch as she crossed the room in long, quick strides. Then it happened. In one smooth, startling motion, Grace jumped. Not a hop, not a skip. She launched herself into the air and soared over the massive marble coffee table in the center of the room. The table was huge, the kind that took 4 men to move. Ethan had seen people walk around it 100 times because climbing over it was nearly impossible. But Grace didn't just clear it. She barely seemed to notice it was there. She landed lightly on her feet, the sound drowned out by the rolling thunder outside. Ethan's eyes went wide. Before he could process what he'd just seen, she turned toward the tall antique cabinet in the corner. It was at least 7 feet high, carved from heavy oak, and filled with glass vases, books, and porcelain figurines. The wind outside rattled the window beside it so hard that the frame shook, and in that moment, one of the cabinet's front legs shifted off the carpet, making it tilt dangerously. Ethan gasped. That cabinet weighed more than most people he knew. But Grace didn't hesitate. She reached it in 3 strides, placed one hand on the side, and shoved it back into place with a single push. The whole thing rocked back upright, not a vase out of place. Ethan's jaw dropped. For a moment, the room was silent except for the rain and his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. How did you do that?" he finally stammered, his voice almost a whisper. Grace turned her head slightly, and for a split second, he thought he saw something, a flicker of surprise, maybe even concern in her eyes. But then her expression softened into her usual easy smile. "Guess I'm stronger than I look," she said with a small wink, picking up the mop as if nothing had happened. Ethan's mind was spinning. People didn't do that. Not normal people, anyway. And Grace was supposed to be just the maid. For a while, he didn't say anything. He pretended to go back to reading his book, but the words on the page blurred. All he could think about was the way she'd moved, like an athlete, or maybe something more. The leap, the strength, the calm in the middle of chaos, it wasn't normal. He felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not pity for himself, not frustration, not boredom, but curiosity. And just beneath that curiosity, a spark of something else. Something small, fragile, but alive. Hope. Because if Grace could do that, maybe, just maybe, he could do something impossible too. That night, as the storm rolled on, Ethan lay awake in his bed, staring at the ceiling. The image of her clearing that table in one effortless leap played over and over in his mind. And for the first time in a very long time, he wondered if the limits he'd set for himself were really as permanent as he thought. Later that week, Grace found Ethan in the library and said, "I heard you used to try walking when you were younger." Ethan looked away. "I always fell. It hurt." Grace leaned closer. You think I never fell? I fell 1,000 times. But every time I fell, I learned how to stand stronger. The only thing worse than falling is never standing at all. Her words echoed in his head for hours. That night, Ethan dreamed of himself running down the mansion's long hallways, the wind in his hair. The next morning, he rolled into the living room where Grace was dusting. "All right," he said nervously. "Help me stand." Grace's face lit up like the sun. She wheeled him to the edge of the sofa, knelt beside him, and said, "I'm not going to pull you up. You're going to push yourself." His arms shook as he braced against the sofa. His legs trembled under his weight. For a terrifying second, he thought he'd collapse, but then he was standing. Wobbly, but standing. His heart raced, his chest burned, but he was smiling for the first time in years. For weeks, the mansion's long hallways echoed with the same sounds. The scrape of Ethan's walker against the polished marble floors, the thud of his small missteps, and Grace's steady, encouraging voice. They trained every single day. Sometimes Ethan lasted only a few minutes before collapsing into the chair, exhausted. Sometimes he fell hard, the sting of the impact shooting up his arms or legs. On those days, frustration would well up in his chest until it spilled out as angry tears. But Grace never let him stay down for long. She would crouch beside him, her voice calm but unshakable. Again, sometimes he would protest. Sometimes he would groan. But she wouldn't move until he tried again. And somehow, no matter how much his legs ached, he always did. Between sessions, she began to tell him pieces of her own story. Not in a boastful way, but as if she wanted him to understand the truth of who she was. She told him how she'd grown up in a poor neighborhood where broken streetlights and empty dinner plates were part of everyday life. How, when she was just 16, her parents died in a car accident, leaving her to raise her 2 younger siblings. How she worked 3 jobs just to keep food on the table, cleaning houses in the morning, waiting tables at night, and helping at a small community gym whenever she could squeeze in the hours. It was at that gym where she had once trained as a track runner, sprinting faster than anyone expected her to. She had trophies, medals, but she didn't keep them. She said real strength wasn't about winning races. It was about refusing to give up when life seemed impossible. Ethan listened closely every time. It wasn't just her strength that amazed him now. It was her resilience. Then came the day. The sky was cloudless, and golden sunlight poured through the mansion's tall glass windows, spilling across the polished floor. The air inside seemed charged, as if the walls themselves knew something was about to happen. Richard Cole, billionaire hotel owner, father, and the man who was always too busy for moments like this, stood quietly in the corner. His usual sharp, businesslike expression was replaced with something softer, though his arms were still crossed tightly as if to hold himself steady. Grace wheeled Ethan into the middle of the room and locked the brakes. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest. This was it. "You ready?" Grace asked. He nodded, his throat too tight for words. She helped him into position, her hands steady but light. Then she stepped back, giving him space, her eyes locked on his in silent encouragement. Ethan gripped the walker with both hands. He took a long, deep breath. He lifted his right foot just a few inches off the ground and swung it forward. It felt heavy, awkward, but it landed. Solid. One step. The room went silent. Richard's breath caught. Grace smiled, her hands clenched in front of her chest as if willing him to keep going. Ethan's pulse thundered in his ears. He shifted his weight, lifted his left foot, and took another step. Then another. Each movement was shaky, his knees trembling, but he didn't stop. With every step, the distance between him and his father grew smaller. He could see Richard's eyes glistening, could hear Grace's soft, "That's it, keep going." By the time he reached his father, Ethan's legs felt like they were made of fire. His arms ached from gripping the walker. But he was upright. He had walked. Richard dropped to one knee in front of him, his expensive suit wrinkling without a second thought, and pulled Ethan into his arms. His voice broke as he whispered, "You did it, son. You did it." Ethan's cheek pressed against his father's shoulder, but his eyes sought out Grace. She stood by the doorway, smiling, not proudly for herself but for him. "No, Dad," Ethan said, a grin spreading across his flushed face. "We did it." From that day forward, Ethan no longer thought of himself as the boy who couldn't walk. He was the boy who had fallen, who had stood back up, who had taken his first steps toward a life he'd once thought impossible. And Grace, she was no longer just the new maid. She became something more, family. The woman who had shown him that sometimes all it takes is seeing the unbelievable to start believing in yourself. The marble floors of the mansion would hear many more footsteps from Ethan in the years to come. But none would ever mean as much as those first ones, the ones he took for himself and for the woman who refused to let him give up.